today we're going to get started on renal. So, believe it or not, we're not actually going to talk about the kidneys specifically today. We're going to start off with our body fluid balance. So it's going to be a lot of where body water resides, how it's going to move in between intracellular and extracellular environments, and how you can measure that. So, I'm going to get started. And one more quick announcement before we actually begin the content. The exam grades will be up probably this afternoon or tomorrow morning. I expect that the mean is probably going to be what I told many of you, that it is the lowest mean of the semester just because the content is a little less intuitive for a lot of people. It usually hovers somewhere around the mid-60s. Okay, so as I said before, don't stress too much about raw score because remember the mean is curved to the middle of the B range. So if the mean is a 65 and you got a 65, you got a B. Okay? Whereas on a normal 10-point scale, that would normally be a D. So hooray for curve. Okay. So I just want to give you a heads up that is coming, not to stress you out, but it is coming and it will be up probably by this afternoon, maybe tomorrow morning, depending. So that's it. Okay? All right. So I'm going to finish this up and let's get started on our body fluid balance. All right. So most of the stuff that we're going to talk about today, you might have some familiarity with it because you've all had chemistry, you've all had physics. You're going to see a lot of stuff that you would have covered in these classes. The first thing that I want to point out is we have a few different types of compartments in the body. We technically have 4 that we talk about in 503, where we talk about where you would find fluid. The one that we're not going to talk about here is mainly because it's a very small amount of fluid in terms of your body fluid compartments. It's the transcellular. That's the stuff that you would find in synovial joints, intrapleural fluid. That all makes up transcellular fluid. What we're going to talk about are your plasma, your interstitial fluid, and your intracellular fluid because they make up the bulk of the body water that you have in your body. Okay? Intracellular fluid, as you can see, is the largest component. That means that's the fluid that's found inside all of your cells in your body added together. So most of your body's fluid resides inside your cells. You do have a large amount that resides in the interstitial space, and then you have a lesser amount that resides as water inside of your plasma. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the kidney's roles in balancing your fluids and electrolytes. The main purpose of your kidney is to maintain blood composition as well as blood volume. So do you remember when we were talking about the Bainbridge reflex in cardiovascular, right? That's going to be something that's triggered in response directly to an increase in blood pressure. But it's an increase in blood pressure due to what reason? Extra fluid. Higher blood volume will increase your blood pressure. So what did the Bainbridge reflex do? Where did it trigger dilation of blood vessels? Kidneys, right? It triggered dilation so that the kidneys could function to remove that excess volume, which would thereby bring down your blood pressure. So when we start talking about body fluid regulation, the important part to keep in mind is that this is not strictly related to the kidneys. It will have an impact on blood pressure, so we will reference a lot of stuff coming from the cardiovascular unit that we did. And then we'll also get into acid-base balance at the end of the semester, which will touch upon the content we talked about in respiratory. So any kind of fluid or electrolytes that you take into your body need to leave your body. If they don't, you will have a net accumulation of that fluid or of that electrolyte, which can cause an imbalance in the normal function of your cells. So fluid intake, clearly that's something that you're going to be drinking stuff. Your fluid intake is regulated by thirst. Anytime your body is somewhat dehydrated, thirst mechanisms are triggered, or you could just be a very diligent drinker of water. I've seen people walk around campus and even in this class coming in with a gallon jug of milk filled with water, okay? So some people, it's not just necessarily just because they're thirsty, it's because that's their habit.
So your kidneys are able to handle a wide range in fluid intake changes as well as electrolyte intake changes. Electrolytes mostly are going to come from food. That's assuming that you drink regular water and regular juices and you don't drink those electrolyte-infused beverages. Then you would have a significant amount of your electrolytes coming from your drinks. But your kidneys are the ones that are regulating getting rid of anything that you're taking in. Okay, so this is going to be hugely important. Anytime we talk about vital organs that need to continue to be perfused under stressful situations, the brain, the heart, kidneys. All right, so if we look at, so by the way, standard person for this unit, 70 kilogram adult. That's our standard weight. So for somebody who in an average day will take in about 2,100 mils, so that's 2.1 liters of fluid a day, just from liquids. From metabolism, you get about 200 mils. So if you're taking in 2.3 liters of fluid every day, then you need to get rid of 2.3 liters every day. What do you notice about most of it that is leaving from the body? Most of it's leaving here. Most of it is leaving because of urine. Now there are two parts that I do want to talk about specifically, and that's these insensible water losses. Insensible simply in this case meaning you can't sense it. You don't sense fluid leaving through the skin unless you are heavily sweating, and then obviously you can. But in general, you are constantly losing fluid through your skin. You are also constantly losing fluid just while breathing. It's one of the reasons why sometimes you might feel thirsty in the morning after you've been sleeping. You lose quite a bit of liquid from your body just by breathing overnight. So that right there is something that really isn't going to change. Sweat can change, urine output can change. Feces isn't really going to change that much. Your gastrointestinal tract does a really good job of reabsorbing most of the fluid. That's how you get your solid waste. So the most malleability really resides in your sweat and your urine in terms of how you're going to lose water from your body. If you were in a condition where you had a high salt diet, so lots of pretzels, lots of salty foods, you have a salt lick, I don't know, whatever it is that causes you to want to have a lot of salt in your body, you still need to match the amount of fluid in order to compensate for the excess electrolytes. And if you're taking in more fluid because you're taking in more salt, then you have to be able to excrete more fluid. Your kidneys are going to compensate for that because they're going to increase urine output. Okay? Everything else is staying the same because your metabolism is staying the same. Your activity level is staying the same in this example. So what do the kidneys do? They just ramp up the amount of fluid leaving from the kidneys as urine. If you did happen to take in a lot of excess salt, it does take time for the kidneys to match the excess amount of salt and water that you're taking in. Okay, so on the top graph here, we're looking at our sodium intake. So up here, we're looking at sodium intake and excretion on the y-axis. And then on the bottom, we're going to look at extracellular fluid volume. So starting up here at the top, this is over the time course of days. So from the moment that you take in that black line that goes vertical, that's the moment you start ramping up your salt intake. And it's going to last for a few days. The dashed line indicates an increase in sodium excretion from the kidneys. You see that it's delayed. So during that time, you have excess amounts of sodium that's being retained. Does anybody have an idea why? Why it takes time for the kidneys to increase excretion after you started your new high salt diet? Which, by the way, is not healthy. Don't do that. Anybody have an idea? You're upregulating channels. If you're upregulating channels, everybody took 553? We're taking it now? Regulation of gene expression, right? It takes time to ramp up the expression of that gene, to get more transcripts, to get it translated, folded properly, inserted into the membranes, so that you can carry more of that salt. So it takes a couple of days for the kidneys to adapt to your new high salt diet. Because of that, there will be a short time frame where you will have retention of sodium because you're consuming more and your kidneys are still excreting the same amount as when you were on your low sodium diet. Okay, eventually it'll catch up and you will match. So you'll have the amount of sodium that you're taking in matched by your kidney's excretion of sodium. The same thing is going to happen as soon as you go back on the right-hand side where you shift back down that black line to the baseline. You stop eating all that salt and you're back on your regular diet. It's going to take a couple of days for the kidneys to recognize that change and stop excreting so much sodium. So during that time frame, you will actually experience a little bit of sodium loss. As those channels are starting to get downregulated and you have fewer of them becoming active in the tubules. But during this time where you are taking in a lot more fluid, you have that sodium retention, what happens to your extracellular fluid volume? It goes up. Part of the reason it goes up is because you're taking in a lot more electrolytes, and specifically salt is a very strongly osmotically active agent. And because of that, it keeps water in the body. More salt you're taking into your body and absorbing into your blood, the osmolality is going to go up. If your osmolality in the blood goes up, the water is going to stay in your blood to try and keep the osmolality as static as possible. Okay? Because of that, it's going to trigger feedback mechanisms, which are what tell you that you have a greater fluid osmolality to allow you to increase thirst, and therefore also increase the amount of volume that's going to stay inside of your body. So when you shift back down after having that high salt diet, the extracellular fluid volume will also decrease back down to your baseline. So your kidneys are really efficient, but because of the mechanism by which they have to ramp up or slow down the excretion, it requires protein synthesis that takes time. So there is a slight lag in the way that it adapts. But at the end of the day, it is very, very efficient to adapt into a wide range of changes in fluid and salt intake. What if you're exercising very heavily? You're sweating a lot more, right? So the big change here is that we have a massive increase in the amount of sweat. Normally, 100 mils. Now we're looking at 5 liters from heavy exercise. So you're ingesting a lot more fluid because you're sweating a lot more. Most of the fluid that you're going to lose is in sweat. So what does that mean for the amount that you're losing in urine? It's going to decrease. Because at the end of the day, you still need to get rid of 6.6 liters. But most of it is coming from your sweat. You are also getting an increase in your insensible loss. Because you're breathing heavier, because you are undergoing heavy exercise, your sweat production is going to go up, so fluid loss will happen there. You're also going to be breathing more heavily because you need to match the oxygen demand of your tissues. So your insensible loss from the lungs is going to increase, but not nearly to the same degree as your sweat. So the kidneys will adapt to either increase or decrease fluid excretion by way of producing urine based on the demands of the body. Its job is just to match whatever's being intaken, whatever's ingested. All right, how are we so far? Yes?
Is there a point at which the insensible amount becomes like sensible, like you lose like a liter through your lungs instead of just 650?
So insensible is referring to your ability to tell that you're losing it in that moment. You can't really feel the water vapor leaving. You might feel thirsty if you're losing it. So in that regard, the difference between sensible and insensible, you can feel when your sweat levels increase. You can feel your breathing increase, but not necessarily the water loss specifically, unless you get to a point where you are thirsty. So it's still considered insensible, meaning you wouldn't be able to consciously sense it, but your body would be able to sense it by stimulating thirst reflexes, if that defines it a little bit better.
For the high salt diet, why initially you would have increase in urine output?
Because that's presuming that if you're having a high salt intake, that you're also having a high fluid intake. So you're increasing the urine output to match the fact that you haven't changed any of your metabolism or activity levels, but you're drinking a lot more because you're taking in a lot more salt.
So if you consume a lot of salt and keep the fluid intake the same, you would have reduced urine output.
Yes, if you didn't increase fluid intake, then you would not increase your urine output, because even though you're taking in more salt, what you would do is have a more concentrated urine. All right, good questions. All right, so next up, I want to talk a little bit about how we determine where our body water is. So just because you can't physically measure all of the water that's inside your body doesn't mean we haven't figured out a way to do it. We do it because there are certain types of compounds, there are certain types of ions that are capable of getting into various compartments and are not able to pass further beyond those compartments. So we can take advantage of some of those in order to identify and calculate the amount of fluid in each one of these body compartments. Before we begin, one part I want to mention, your total body water will be relative to total body weight and body mass index. Infants' total body water is always going to be higher than an adult. They are a lot more fluid, buoyant than we are. As you get older, women tend to have less body water than men do, and that body water level will change based on how much lean muscle compared to adipose tissue that you have. The more adipose tissue that's present, the more fat that's present, the less body water there is. So this is looking at percentages of your body, which is what we're going to get ready to start calculating. The other part to point out is that age will also decrease. That's the reason for the example with the infant to the adult. But even young adult, like all of you guys, versus older adult, you will also see a decrease happening in your total body water as you age. All right, so how are we going to measure this? Conservation of mass. Okay, so way back to just standard mass over volume gives you your concentration. That's the principle that we're using to figure out how much body water you have in each compartment. All right. So we're going to take some kind of indicator, and we'll have a set concentration of that indicator in a syringe. There will be a certain volume of that indicator, which means you can calculate the mass. That mass is going to be injected into your body. When it's injected, it's going to evenly disperse in whatever fluid compartment it's able to get into, and then you allow it to reach equilibrium so that then you know that you have no change in mass, but you do have a change in concentration. The mass of the indicator is the same in compartment B as you had inside that syringe. You didn't add or lose any molecules of that indicator. Okay, the only thing you did was change the volume into which it's dissolved. So we can use the fact that the mass is not changing in order to figure out the volume in each of those compartments based on whatever the concentration of that indicator is in the compartment that we're going to measure. Oh, sorry. There are a few things that we have to take into account, though. This only works if your indicator is going to disperse completely, evenly, and only in the compartment that you're trying to measure. If it goes anywhere else, you no longer have conservation of mass, and you can't do this. So it's really important to choose your indicator to measure specifically which compartments you want to look at, knowing that it's not going to leave that compartment. Okay, if you have any loss, then that's going to be an issue, which comes into the next part. If you choose an indicator that is metabolized or excreted, you have another big problem. We can't use glucose as an indicator. Why? Every cell in your body is going to chew it up. And your mass now goes away. Okay? So it can't be something that is metabolized or excreted. And if it is, you need to make some kind of correction for that. So it's a little easier just to pick something that you know is not going to be metabolized and not going to be excreted. All right, so fair warning, you do need to know these indicators. And you do need to know where they go in the body. Okay? So we're going to start with total body water. We're talking about water. So heavy water, or your deuterium, or your tritium water, so your radioactive water, both of those are just water. It's labeled water, but it's water. So you can use that to measure total body water. You also can use a molecule called antipyrine. This stems from work that was done, it was published way back in like 1949. It was done on dogs. And it's a lipid-soluble small molecule that's able to get through all membranes, so it's able to get into every part of the body. Not just an extracellular, but it can actually go through cell membranes and permeate the intracellular environment as well. So antipyrine is something that can be used to measure total body water as well, even though technically it's not water itself. So those are the three molecules that you can use in order to just see how much total water you have inside of your body. Okay? Because they will go in through the plasma, they will get into the interstitial fluid, and they will get inside your intracellular environment. Extracellular volume. What makes up extracellular volume? Which of these compartments are your extracellular volume? Plasma and interstitial fluid together. That's your extracellular fluid. Okay, so you want something that's going to get into your blood, which all of it's going to get into your blood. Do you know why? That's where you're putting it. Yeah, exactly. Anytime we're going to do something like this, you're infusing it into your blood. The question is, does it leave your blood, and does it go anywhere else? So these three, your inulin, which we'll talk a lot about a little bit later on in terms of GFR, or glomerular filtration rate, thiosulfate and heavy sodium are all molecules or ions that are going to enter into your plasma. They can actually get out of your blood vessels and into the interstitial fluid, but they will not routinely enter into your cells. So it will stay in your extracellular compartment. Okay? So how are you going to measure interstitial fluid only?
Subtract the amount that's in plasma.
Bingo. That's all you do. You take your total body water and you get rid of your extracellular fluid for your intracellular environment. If you want to do your interstitial, you take your total extracellular and subtract your plasma. If you want to figure out your plasma volume, we have a few different ways to do that as well. One of them is your radioactively labeled iodine. That is going to bind to albumin. And if it binds to albumin, does albumin leave your blood? No. It shouldn't. I should say that. It shouldn't. If it does, we have a problem. Okay? And that will come into play when we start talking about glomerular filtration rate. If you ever see any protein showing up in the urine, we have an issue. Okay? So, under normal circumstances, albumin tagged with iodine should stay in your blood. So, if it's going to stay in your blood, it's not going outside of the plasma. Okay? It's not going to leave through the endothelial cells. The other one is radioactively labeled chromium, which binds very, very tightly to red blood cells. Again, red blood cells, not going to leave through the plasma, not going to leave through your endothelial cells inside of your blood vessels. So if you tag either your red blood cells or your protein, that molecule is going to stay inside of your blood. So you can use that to measure plasma. You're going to inject it there, it's not going to be able to leave. So at the end of the day, we have 3 different compartments we're measuring directly. We're looking very specifically at our total, we're looking at extracellular, and we're looking at plasma. Why? Every single one of these is being injected into your bloodstream. Okay? We can figure out the intracellular and the interstitial by using some of these little equations to subtract. Okay? The only way that we can figure that out, we don't measure those directly. The only way you can figure it out is by figuring out what your extracellular fluid is, what your total fluid is, and what your plasma fluid is. And then use those parameters to figure out the rest. Because everything is injected into your blood, and it just is a question of how far down it's going to go. Okay? So, take a second and think about what you would want to do. If you were to inject 10 mils of antipyrine, so think about where antipyrine is going to go, and at this particular concentration. Once you reach equilibrium, which means everything is uniformly distributed, all the fluids in your body have reached a new concentration of antipyrine, which is that 0.03 milligrams per mil, what would be your total body water? This is assuming that you're not increasing, and you're not having any kind of excretion, so you're not losing any of the antipyrine. Remember, we're talking conservation of mass here, and you can talk to each other if you're stuck. Okay. Anybody need more time? Okay, maybe a couple more seconds. Most people are getting it pretty well. You might not show up as being, you might not show up as being correct because again, remember it has to match exactly what I wrote. So, we have a lot of different responses here. Alright, so let's see what's correct. 58% of you got it right. Now, how did we calculate this? 10 times 150, right? So you have 10 mils at a concentration of 150. Gives you how many milligrams? 1,500. 1,500 milligrams now is the mass that you have at a new concentration of 0.03. Right? So 1,500 divided by 0.03 gives you what? 50,000 mils. Or 50 liters, okay? So I put in parentheses in liters. But if you wrote 50,000, technically you're correct if you were thinking milliliters. All right, so how do we feel so far? Pretty good? Yeah.
Is this, like, real? Is this accurate?
What do you mean?
Is this, like, representative of, like...
Oh, what you would actually have in the body?
Stuff.
So you would look at between 40 and 50. liters of water.
Wow.
Yeah, depending on the person's body mass index, depending on their age, and then depending on specifically how much they weigh. Because we're going to go through a whole calculation where you walk through based on body weight, what percentage typically resides outside and what resides inside, and then how you would calculate the amount of water that's outside versus inside. So we're going to walk through all of that, and you'll see how that can change if you do an infusion, and you know from earlier the percentages change based on weight and age. All right. Oh. Sorry, seems to have kicked me out. All right, so let's do the next one. So, based on what you remember, how would you measure interstitial volume? Which of these substances would you use in order to measure your interstitial volume? Okay. Couple more seconds. All right. So, how do we measure interstitial? Specifically. Extracellular minus plasma. Okay? So here's what we got. Congratulations, those who chose D. Which you can't see because it's not going to let me scroll down. So, we want to look at specifically inulin and albumin, labeled albumin, in this example. Why? What's going to label all of your extracellular fluid? Inulin. And your blood? Albumin. Right? So your radioactively labeled iodine will be tagged in your albumin. I'm sorry that Top Hat doesn't allow me to put superscript in here, so that's supposed to be 125, the heavy labeled iodine. All right, so how do we feel so far about the different types of indicators that you're going to use for different parts of the body? Pretty good? Okay. You do need to know those. You've been warned. Okay. All right, so the other part I wanted to point out before we move on very quickly has to do with something we discussed in the cardiovascular unit. Specifically, our hematocrit. Okay? So, what is your hematocrit? What does it refer to?
It's the part of your blood that's all the cells and stuff.
It's the part of your blood that's not liquid, right? It's the cells. It's the percentage or proportion of your blood that is made up of cellular components. Excuse me. Typically, we'll just pick an average of about 0.4. That means 40%. If you took 1 milliliter of blood and you spun it down in a centrifuge, you would have 40% of that 1 mil. So 400 microliters would be your actual cells. The other 600 microliters would be plasma. Okay? So when we start talking about blood volume versus plasma volume, this will come into play when we start talking about renal blood flow versus renal plasma flow. Technically, the flow themselves are pretty closely related, but when we talk about blood flow, we're going to talk about the movement of everything going through. If you have a higher viscosity, your cells are going to slow down the overall blood flow, which will slow down your plasma flow. But in terms of the actual volume, your blood volume has to take into account all of the cellular components, whereas your plasma volume doesn't. So if you want to convert between the two, you take your blood volume, which we'll show down here. You take your blood volume here, sorry about that, blood volume, and you'll multiply it by the part of the blood that is not cells. So if your hematocrit tells you how much it is made up of cellular components, the part that is liquid is going to be 1 minus the hematocrit. So if your hematocrit's 0.45, what would you multiply this by? 0.55, right? Okay, because that tells you that's the liquid component of your blood. And that will give you your plasma volume. To calculate blood volume from plasma volume, it's just the reverse of this. You just take the plasma volume and you divide it by 1 minus the hematocrit. Okay? That's another thing I want to pay attention to. Okay, so how are we going to look at distribution, not just in the body as a whole, but specifically inside of your cells versus in your extracellular environments? Specifically across your cell membranes, this is an area that we cover a lot in 503. We're specifically looking at gradients and osmotic forces. Those osmotic forces are going to tell you how much fluid is moving into your cells or out of your cells based on the osmolarity or osmolality inside your cell versus the extracellular environment. It should be the same. If it's not, water will move to try and create that balance. In our microcirculation, we talked about what type of pressures for capillaries? Hydrostatic, colloid osmotic, or oncotic. That whole figure that you probably all have drilled into your brains by now, you're going to be happy you did because it's going to come back when we start talking about GFR. Okay? So hydrostatic and colloid osmotic forces will tell you if fluid's going to cross the capillary membranes and in which direction. Whereas simple osmotic forces will tell you whether or not it's going to go into each of your cells. Osmotic pressure is something that you can calculate based on the concentration, the universal gas constant, and your temperature in Kelvin. Now, if we're looking at measuring the osmotic pressure in millimeters of mercury, then this is your value. Okay? Some of you from chemistry might remember if you measure it in Newton meters over Newton meters over moles times Kelvin, then you will have a number of 8.3 in your mind from the universal gas constant, 8.314 or 4 or something. That's only if you're going to be looking at, if you're not measuring it in millimeters of mercury, you're measuring it in pascals. Okay, so different unit. For our purposes, the universal gas constant will be 62.3 because we're going to measure everything in millimeters of mercury. So, if you were to calculate that, 6.23 times 310 gives you this value down here of that 19,300 millimeters of mercury per osmol. Since everything in your body is going to be in milliosmoles, we're going to look at 19.3 would be the value to convert it when we're talking about milliosmoles. And it won't let me underline that. So on the bottom. If you take that value for RT and you multiply by whatever the concentration is, then you will get your osmotic pressure. Okay? If your body temperature changes, then that 19.3 is going to change, right? Because we're looking at temperature in Kelvin, and that's one of the parameters. Universal gas constant, not going to change. Okay, so for all intents and purposes, 19.3 is a good one to remember as the RT value for your osmotic pressure. And then you just multiply by whatever the concentration is in order to figure out what the osmotic pressure is that's going to govern which way your fluid is going to move, inside or outside the cell. So, let's talk about osmotic equilibrium now. You guys liking the chemistry recap? Has it been a while since we've had chemistry? Not too long, I hope. All right, so if we're looking at this, and I just now see that I have a little typo. Sorry about that. The intracellular osmolarity should actually be 7850 or something like that. I typed that wrong, sorry. Your extracellular concentration, your osmolarity, should equal your intracellular concentration. If it doesn't, what's going to happen? Fluid's going to move. Fluid is going to move to try and maintain that osmotic equilibrium. Okay? So if you actually calculated these themselves, what value would you get for the osmolarity of the extracellular fluid? Somebody want to tell me? Or at least how you calculate it? How would you calculate the osmolarity of the ECF based on these numbers? I'm just saying the one compartment. So extracellular volume, fluid volume.
So
The volume is 14 liters, so what would you do?
you would just divide the osmoles by the liters.
Yeah, you would divide 3920 by 14, you get 280 milliosmolar. We'll take advantage of my mistake. What would the other intracellular osmolarity be? 7980 divided by 2080. Anybody want to calculate? I think it's a little higher. 285. Okay, so these are not in equilibrium. So, if they're not in equilibrium, which way would your fluid move? If inside your cell is 285 milliosmoles osmolarity and your ECF is 280. Which way is fluid going to move? It's going to move in, right? So your fluid is going to try and dilute out the osmolarity inside the cell so that it matches the outside. It's going to take fluid away from the ECF and add it to the ICF. The goal is to make sure that you have an osmotically equivalent intracellular and extracellular environment. So if you take a cell and you put it in an isotonic solution, this specifically is a little different than isosmotic. Something that is isosmotic may not be isotonic. You guys remember the difference between osmolarity and tonicity? No. Okay. A brave person to answer. Okay, so osmolarity simply refers to the number of particles in a solution, period. It's just the total number of particles that's present inside of your solution, regardless of how it behaves across a particular membrane. Okay, that doesn't matter. For osmolarity, we're looking strictly at concentration. Tonicity looks at the relative amounts of concentration on either side of a particular membrane. So it's a very specific scenario where it's looking at if something is in a hypertonic solution, it's hypertonic solution because of that particular membrane that we're discussing at that moment. That same osmolarity of that solution might not be hypertonic across a different membrane. So tonicity will take into account your insoluble or the impermeable solutes. The solutes that are not able to cross that semi-permeable membrane. Whereas osmolarity is going to take into account every single solute, regardless of its permeability with that membrane. Okay? So for an isotonic solution, there's not going to be any change in volume because the osmolarity outside of the cell and the osmolarity inside the cell is the same, and either everything is permeable or nothing is permeable. You're not going to have a net movement of a solute, which therefore would draw the movement of water in one direction or the other. If you have a situation where we're looking at a hypertonic solution, so down here. So hypertonic specifically means that the solution has a higher or lower concentration of osmotically active agents compared to the intracellular environment. Higher. Okay? The solution is hypertonic. What's going to happen to the cell? Water's going to leave because it's going to try and match the osmolarity inside and outside of the cell. Okay? It's specifically going to take a look at the solute outside the cell. What do we have to know about that particular solute in terms of its permeability? It can't be permeable to the membrane. Otherwise, is it going to stay hypertonic? No. Because that solute will move into the cell and bring water inside the cell. Okay? So you have to take into account the permeability of the solute that's in that solution before you can even think about which direction something is going to move. So for hypotonic, same thing. you have a movement of water to try and balance out the concentrations, except this time the inside of your cell has a higher osmolarity than the outside of your cell. And assuming that your solutes can't cross the barrier, the only thing that can is your water. So water will come into the cell to try and dilute the intracellular environment. How do we feel about that? Because I'm going to ask you some questions about this soon. Yeah?
So does this figure show that the solute is permeable to the membrane or not?
No. No. This is not permeable to the membrane. If it were permeable, let's say that you were in the hypotonic solution here, and we had a situation where everything that was inside your cell was permeable and everything that was outside of your cell, your fake little cell here, was also permeable. And you put it in a hypotonic solution. What would happen?
Wait, what?
Everything's permeable. If everything's permeable, water's not the only thing moving. So the solute will be able to leave. Now, depending on how much solute is inside your cell and how much volume is outside your cell, you could still end up with an imbalance in water. You might not be able to reach that osmotic equilibrium based on how much that mass is getting diluted. But if everything is permeable, water is not the only thing moving. This example is talking about tonicity in a case where you're putting your cell inside of a solution where it's not, none of your solutes are permeable. So the solute inside of that solution can't go in. So the only thing that can go in to try and dilute it out to make sure that you hit that same balance of osmolarity is the water. And so the end result would show no change in osmolarity for the isotonic. This is your hypotonic, and that's your hypotonic, which means that water is going to leave to try and dilute your hypertonic solution, or water is going to enter the cell to try and raise the tonicity or the osmolarity of your solution to match what's inside the cell, as well as dilute what's inside the cell. Okay. So let's take a second and see about calculating the osmolarity of a 5% glucose solution. And then I want you to tell me if that is hyperosmotic, hypoosmotic, or isosmotic. My first question for you is, how many people know how to calculate a percent solution?
Time.
Anybody remember? Anytime you see a solution that's presented as a percentage, the quick and dirty way to do it is take that percentage number, put grams after it, divide it by 100 mils. It's basically grams per deciliter. Okay? So 5% glucose solution would be 5 grams of glucose in 100 mils of solution. Now can you calculate it? You guys can talk to each other. It's okay. Getting frustrated? Are we need more time? You just want me to move on? Okay. All right, so I'm going to stop you. And let's see. We got lots and lots of different answers. Woo! All right, so don't worry. It's just because you didn't write exactly what I put. 278 and osmotic. Now, let's walk through this quickly. First things first, 5% solution. 5 grams per 100 mils gives you what?
0.05
0.05 what?
grams per milliliter.
Grams. So 5 grams divided by 100 mils gives you your grams per liter. So what is 5 over 100? Gives you 0.05 for grams per mil. What do you get grams per liter? Because we're going to be talking about molarity. 50. So if you have 50, and we're looking at, because we're going to do, we want to eventually calculate milliosmoles per liter. So, oh, hey. Okay. So if we want to calculate our grams per mil, we have 50 grams per liter. Okay? For our grams per mole, for our molecular weight of glucose, what do we do with that? Given 50 grams per liter, what do we do with the molecular weight?
50 by 180.
You're going to divide 50 by 180 and you get 0.278. Okay, so you get 0.278 moles per liter. We want millimoles per liter, so it's 278 millimoles per liter. Now, one of your classmates asked a good question about how you go from millimoles to milliosmoles. In this case, they're the same thing. They won't always be the same thing, because osmolarity is looking at osmotically active agents, molarity is looking at the compound as a whole. So in this case, glucose doesn't change its composition when it's in solution. Right? Molecularly, it's still C6H12O6. So molarity and osmolarity is going to be the same. So you have a 278, which is roughly equivalent to the 280 that we had been using as our normal. So we have a solution that is about isosmotic with body molarity.
So 280 is the standard we should know?
280 or 300, depending on what text you read.
Okay.
So it'll be one of those two. On an exam or something, I would tell you that your standard is going to be 280 or 300. So if this is the case for an isosmotic solution, what about its tonicity? Can glucose cross cell membranes? Well,
Not by itself.
not by itself, but what do your cell membranes have? They have channels. Okay? They have transporters. So if glucose is able to get inside of your cell or outside of your cell, which usually it's not going to get outside of your cell, it's going to go in, right, because your cell's going to use it, what would the solution be? If glucose can cross, it's now permeable. So if it's nice osmotic, and now you have just glucose outside the cell, and you have a whole mess of other stuff inside the cell that gives the same osmolarity. But now glucose can come in. It's hypotonic. The solution is hypotonic. Why? Because glucose can enter the cell. And if glucose enters the cell, what's going to follow? Water. So if a solution is hypotonic, it means that that cell is going to take on water when it's placed in that solution. Why is glucose going to move inside the cell? Say it again?
The concentration.
You've got a massive concentration gradient. Remember, everything inside your cell is a whole bunch of osmotically active particles that are all acting together to give you that 278. Your solution, the only osmotically active particle is glucose. So there's a massive concentration gradient, which means that it would move in the cell. Okay? So if you take a cell and you put it in a hypotonic solution, by definition, that means that that hypotonic solution will cause the cell to take on water. If you put that cell in a hypertonic solution, the cell is going to lose water. But it's all relative based on what that membrane is permeable to and impermeable to. If glucose can't cross the membrane, is it still hypotonic? If glucose is impermeable? No. It's isosmotic, same concentration. Fluid's not going to move to try and balance anything. And no particles are going to cross the membrane either, so everything's going to stay where it is. How do we feel? Good? All right. Up next. What about the osmolarity of a 3% sodium chloride solution? And is that going to be hypertonic, hypotonic, or isotonic? And now we're talking salt. Assume your salt is impermeable. Okay. You guys want another couple of seconds? All right. 5 seconds. All right, let's see how we do. Okay, yay, this is exactly what I was hoping for. Good talking point. 513 and 1026. Technically both correct numbers, but the correct answer is somewhere here. There you go. 1026. Okay? The reason for that is because of the relationship between molarity and osmolarity. So first of all, how do we get the 512 or 513?
Same way we did the last one.
Yep, which means we have 3 grams per 100 mils. And so we get your 30 grams per mil, and we divided that by 58.5. We get 0.513 for molarity, 513 millimoles per liter. What does sodium chloride do in a solution? So 1 molecule becomes 2 osmotically active particles. Okay? So 513 millimoles is the same as twice that in milliosmoles. Now, that's assuming 100% is going to dissociate. That doesn't actually happen. You would actually have to multiply that by the rate at which it would actually dissociate. That's your osmotic coefficient, would tell you the percentage with which that would typically dissociate. So for something like that, oh, sorry, we did that again, didn't it? You get that. So when we're looking at this value, we have 513 for millimoles. 1 mole of sodium chloride becomes 2 osmoles of sodium and chloride when it's in the solution. So you have to take into account how many particles it's going to dissociate into. It's still going to be hypertonic because 1,000 is a lot higher than 300. Okay? It's hypertonic because nothing is going to cross that barrier, right? The membrane is impermeable to this, so it's hypertonic and it's hyperosmotic. Okay? If it didn't dissociate completely, you would take that 1026 and you'd multiply it by whatever the osmotic coefficient is. So if it was if 93% of it dissociated but the other parts didn't, you'd multiply that by 0.93 to get the actual osmolarity. Okay? Assuming that it's not 100% efficient. But for this calculation, we're assuming everything dissociated. Does everybody see how we get to 1026 now? Okay, that's going to become really important in the next part that we're going to do. All right. Apparently when I put two questions back to back, it gets mad at me.
I think it just doesn't like you in general.
I think so. All right, we'll do this way. So now let's look at how we're going to calculate our differences between extracellular and intracellular volumes and osmolarities after you've given some kind of fluid administration. Okay, an intravenous infusion of a solution. We're going to look at what it is before you start anything, and then what it's going to change afterwards. Where is the fluid going to go as it redistributes? So our example here, we're going to take 2 liters of a 3% sodium chloride solution. So we're effectively giving somebody a high salt diet. Okay? As a general rule, a good rule of thumb is that your extracellular fluid can be estimated to be about 20% of your body weight. Your intracellular fluid keeps about 40% of your body weight in terms of the liters of fluid. Okay? So if I give you the body weight in kilograms, you can use these percentages to estimate what the normal distribution of body fluid water in liters would be for each compartment. We're also assuming in this case that our plasma osmolarity is going to be 280 before we give anything. Okay? Now, I gave you guys access ahead of time to a lovely little chart, but I took out the numbers. Okay? So we're going to run through this because I found that this was the most straightforward way to line up these calculations. If we're going to start at our initial condition, so we haven't added anything yet, and we're not going to add anything, the first thing we're going to do is figure out what the distribution is of fluid and what the total number of milliosmoles is in each compartment. So, if we're looking at extracellular and intracellular fluid of our 70 kilogram person, what's going to be the volume of the extracellular fluid in liters? 14. And in our intracellular? 28. So what does that mean for our total? Add them together. This person has 42 liters of fluid in their whole body. 14 of them are in the extracellular fluid, which is interstitial and plasma. 28 of it is inside all of the cells of the body. Okay? Completely aggregate, total intracellular fluid volume. Now, how are we going to figure out how many milliosmoles are in each compartment? You're going to multiply 14 by what? 280, right? We're taking a volume, and that volume we know at equilibrium, all of the compartments have reached equilibrium, so they all have the same osmolarity, which means they all have 280. So if you multiply them across, you get there are 920 milliosmoles in the extracellular fluid, 7840 in the intracellular fluid, and then you add them together to get the total. So multiplied, and you can just add these, or you could do the same thing down here. Okay? That doesn't look much like a plus, does it? All right? So, figuring out your starting point tells you how many milliosmoles osmoles are present in each of the compartments of your body. This is our starting point, okay? Everybody good with this so far? Because now we're going to throw a whole bunch of salt in the body. All right, so first off, the calculation that we just ran through verbally, I have it up here so that if you didn't catch all of that, we'll walk through it together. 30 grams per liter, because it's 3 grams per 100 mils, gives you that 30 grams. You multiply it by 1 mole over the molecular weight, you get 513 millimoles. 1 millimole is 2 milliosmoles because it's going to dissociate in a solution. So the result is you take that and you convert millimole to milliosmoles, you get 1026 milliosmoles per liter. Now, what are we infusing? 2 liters. So now what do we do? Multiply by 2, right? 2 liters at this concentration gives us 2,052 milliosmoles. That is the number of particles that we're adding to the body. Where are those particles going? Plasma and interstitial. It's staying in the extracellular environment. It's not going to go into the cells, correct? So any kind of infusion we have is staying in the extracellular environment. So where are we going to add this 2052? We're going to add it to the extracellular milliosmoles and total. Right? Because we're still adding it to everything. What about this one? Why are we at 44 now? Just added 2 liters of water. Okay, so we added our 2,052 milliosmoles. We added it to the extracellular fluid because it's sodium chloride. It's not going inside the cells. So we're not adding anything to the intracellular environment. So the number of milliosmoles in the extracellular fluid has changed. Intracellular fluid stays the same, but because you added 2,000 extra, you have to also change the total. We added 2 liters of solution to get this infusion into the body. So now we have 44. What's the next step? Say it louder.
You have to redo your math and check the individual concentrations of the extracellular and intracellular fluid.
Yes, so we're going to look at concentrations. Now, the big key point here is after osmotic equilibrium. So what does that mean for the concentrations in all of these different compartments? They're all going to be the same. Okay? So now we're measuring it after everything has reached equilibrium. So what do you do to figure out the concentration for total fluid? Milliosmoles divided by liters. Okay? And since we are reached osmotic equilibrium, what does that mean for the intracellular and extracellular fluid osmolarities? They should be the same. If you count, you can use the total in order to calculate what your total body fluid osmolarity is. You get 314. What did we have before? 280. Okay, so it's gone up. So 314 is now our new concentration. And because we've reached osmotic equilibrium, that's the same concentration that you're going to find in the intracellular and extracellular environment. Now, the reason we have everything equal is because water has shifted around in order to maintain this new balance and make sure that our osmolarity is now uniform. How are we going to figure out volume in the intracellular and extracellular fluid? You're going to divide the total milliosmoles by the concentration to get the liters. So we end up with 19 liters for the extracellular, and we end up with 25 for the intracellular. What did we have in the initial beginnings onset, before we did anything, for the extracellular fluid? 14, okay? So we have 5 more liters of fluid showing up in the extracellular environment. What did we have initially for the inside? We had 28. What do we have now? We lost 3. So how could we gain 5 in the extracellular and lose 3 in the intracellular? Because you added those other 2 to the extracellular. So basically what happened here was 2 liters got added to the extracellular environment, And then the extracellular fluid sucked another 3 liters from all of the intracellular environment of the body. As everything was redistributed, this is now the new fluid distribution based on the new osmolarity. Okay? So extracellular went up by 5, intracellular went down by 3, that intracellular went to the extracellular plus the 2 that you mentioned. Yeah.
Can you please repeat how you went from the total to the concentration? Like how you went from 5,972 to 314?
Oh, so we didn't actually do that. What we did was we took this number and we divided it by the 44. Oops, sorry, that didn't look nice. Divided it by the 44, and that's how we got the 314. And because we reached osmotic equilibrium, all of these are going to be the same.
Okay.
Yeah, and then you use those concentrations to calculate the liters after that. How do we feel? Not too bad? All right. Okay, so a couple of questions now. This one should be pretty familiar because we just calculated it. But I want you to take a look at this and see if you can tell me what the effect is of adding what we just added. 2 liters of 3% sodium chloride. Your dashed lines are the intracellular fluid compartment. That's normal. And I don't know, whatever that, they're dots maybe? It's supposed to be your extracellular. Which one of these? 1, 2, or 3? It's a multiple choice question. 1, 2, or 3 would be a graphical representation of what you would expect to see by doing this infusion. Where does the fluid go based on what we just talked about? Okay, I'm going to stop you because most people are getting this one right, which is good. What's the answer? 2. 2 is the answer because, as we said, we gained a lot in the extracellular and we lost some in the intracellular, and the osmolarity went up. Okay? Extracellular fluid volume went up, fluid osmolarity went up, the intracellular osmolarity went up because these two are going to match, and the intracellular went down. So this is just a summary of what we had actually calculated. All right, last couple of questions. 2 liters of water. What happens if you add 2 liters of water? You're not adding any solute. What would happen to the osmolarity? It'd go down. And everywhere or just in one compartment? Everywhere. Okay? So the correct answer for this one would be 3 because you would see a reduction in osmolarity and an increase in volume of both compartments. Sorry, I don't know why it's not letting me do that. We're almost done, that's why I want to show you. The end here. No. Okay, I'll just put it up on the screen. If you just added water intravenously, your extracellular fluid volume and intracellular volume is going to go up because it will evenly distribute, and your osmolarity will go down. I will assign these 4 as homework so you guys can run through some practice of being able to answer these questions for adding different concentrations. Okay? All right, I will see you guys next week.